Welcome to Continuing Education Module, Understanding Workers' Compensation, Some Insights for Wellness Professionals. Our agenda for this module includes some basic definitions in history, a general pattern of workers' compensation, suggestions for measurement, some patterns for wellness and workers' comp, some targeting options with programming, and a summary of key points. Our definition to start with is that workers' compensation is a form of insurance providing wage replacement and medical benefit coverage. So that's our two major issues. It provides a continuation of wage and wage replacement, salary and wage, and medical benefit reimbursement. It's for employees who are injured in the course of employment in exchange for mandatory relinquishment of the employee's right to sue his or her employer for the tort of negligence. So the trade-off between the assured limited coverage and lack of recourse outside the workers' compensation system is known as the compensation bargain. One of the problems that the compensation bargain solved is the problem of employers becoming insolvent as a result of high damage awards. The system of collective liability was created to prevent that and thus to ensure security of compensation to the workers. Individual immunity is the necessary corollary to collective liability. Now, the history of workers' compensation is that early state laws essentially called for a voluntary nature to this coverage. Maryland was the first to pass a compulsory law on workers' comp in 1902. The compulsory versions prevented by due process concerns. So that was the issue of the balance between trading off your right to sue your employer against the due process considerations of the general law. In 1917, the Supreme Court decision eliminates that concern, so it set the stage for states to be able to balance off the waiver of one's ability to sue their employer for negligence versus the issue of having compensation for wage and salary losses during the time of absence and the costs of medical care provided in pursuit of the treatment. By 1949, all states have compulsory or mandatory workers' compensation laws. They now include salary and wage continuation, some economic damages and benefits to heirs in the event of death or dismemberment. So you can find various schedules of payments to heirs based on some of the more extreme health situations coming from injuries or illness in the worksite. States vary by use of private vendors, state roles, self-insurance, and legal remedies. So there is variation from state to state in workers' comp. You need to know the state that you're dealing in, whether there are specific issues that have to do with the state's role, the allowing private vendors to provide the service, as well as self-insuring against the liability or loss, and legal options and alternatives. Now, you can be sure that all workers are covered by some workers' compensation provision, that every employer is either insured or self-insured for workers' comp. There is an exact cost to workers' comp each year, and that some cases are left open at the end of each year. So there is usually a assignment of financial cost associated with medical reimbursement and salary continuation that is identified by each annual period of time, each fiscal year that an organization is operating in, and then cases are either determined as closed or open at the end of each year. Somebody in every organization knows the annual cost. So usually in the finance department, and it's usually someone that's in a financial role and can provide insight into what those costs are. The cost is the function of the number of cases, what we call frequency, times the average cost or case severity, or per case severity. So there's the issue of frequency times severity. That's the issue we deal with in all of healthcare in terms of the epidemiologic perspective, that we have a number of cases occurring during a given time period, and they have an average cost associated with their settlement or with their coverage at a point in time. Incidence and severity are tremendously variable. So depending on the type of risk that the organization is facing in terms of illness and injury to workers, those incidence and severity issues can vary tremendously. Wellness is likely to affect both frequency and severity of cases. So the incidence or prevalence of numbers of cases during a time period versus the average cost or the severity of each case. Wellness interventions can target workers' comp. So we can in fact look at behaviors, risk-taking, and things like present moment thinking that are techniques that can reduce workers' compensation costs. Now, worker health-related costs, 2015, we want to go back and look at the numbers here. And what we generally see is that for presenteeism, about $20,000 per employee per year is an average national cost. That's derived from the Dow Chemical Collins article. And then about $13,000, $14,000 of health benefit costs per employee per year, and that's a combination of both the single premium, the single employee premium, and the family coverage premiums. So that would be an average between those two extremes. And then about $2,200 in sick leave costs, another $870 some in workers' comp costs, and then about $1,400 in disability. So the workers' comp is in fact the smallest health-related costs that we generally deal with in worker health. And that total of all of those 5 types of health-related costs for workers on a national level averages about $37,000 per employee per year. And again, presenteeism costs are work productivity loss when the individual chooses to stay at work but is impaired by an underlying health problem. And we also have to remember that we're talking about spending somewhere around $300 per year per employee on a wellness budget. That does not include staffing costs or incentive costs, because there's lots of ways of being able to do that without costing the employer anything. So the issue here is that budget on wellness is less than 1% of what is being spent currently on the worker health related issues for a given work environment, work setting. Now, health risk increase workers' comp costs, and this is some of the earlier studies that were done by Musich and colleagues. It looked at about 3,388 people for 4 years. It tracked their risk factors and their workers' comp spending. And if you had a low overall wellness score, which is what OWS stands for, you would essentially have used on average 20 times the amount of workers' comp costs than the person who has a high overall wellness score, meaning they do not have many risk factors. So if you have multiple risk factors, your workers' compensation spending is going to be approximately 20 times the amount of the healthier set of habits and behaviors that are part of an individual. And then smoking, about 12 times the amount of workers' comp cost, and that's a 1 pack a day or more of cigarette smoking as a usual basis. If you're reporting poor health on the question that comes out of the RAND Health Insurance Study results, that poor health report will then be aligned with about 8 times the workers' comp cost on average. And then if you are not an exerciser, regular exerciser, it's about 5.5 times. And then if you're reporting low life satisfaction as a risk factor, then that's about 2.5 times the amount of workers' comp costs. So those are percent higher annual workers' comp costs associated with the various risk factors. And this is looking at an actuarially sound population, multi-year assessment. Now, this next study is multiple health risk multiply workers' comp costs. And here we're looking at the issues Again, of that same population, about 3,338 individuals for 4 years of activity. And the report here is that if you had 0 to 1 risk factor, your average workers' comp cost was $106. If you had 2 to 4 or 2 to 3 risk factors, 228. And if you had 4 or more risk factors, your spending was at $1,241 on average each year. So what that basically shows us is there's about a 12-fold difference between the individual who is at low risk, does not have a lot of health risk that we generally measure in wellness, versus the high risk individual that does in fact have those specific issues. So these are some of the ways in which we look at the issue of multiple health risk and how they multiply workers' comp cost in a geometric manner. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics provides a system for classifying injuries and illness under workers' comp. And it works on the nature of the problem, and that's the physical characteristic of that disabling injury or illness. And all workers' comp are either injuries or illness as their basis. And then the issues of the nature of the injury can be things such as cuts, lacerations, fractures, sprains, concussions, a whole variety of things that are part of the nature of the problem. The part of the body affected is also part of the BLS system, so that classifies by the nature of whether it was an arm or a finger or back or elbow or whatever. The event or exposure is the manner in which the injury or illness was produced or inflicted, such as being caught in a machine, in a running equipment, slips, trips, falls, overexertion, contact with electric current, burns, so on. The source is the object, substance, exposure, or bodily motion that directly produced or inflicted the disabling condition. And that can be such things as equipment and machinery, contact with the ground, patient or electrical wiring. Identifies the object, the substance, or person that generated the source. It's more like the source of what the problem was that actually produced the injury or the illness. So this is called the Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Injury and Illness Classification System. That's what this is from. And the secondary source is the illness or what contributed to the event or exposure, such as ice or severe weather or smoke or whatever. So those are secondary source kinds of implications. So all workers' compensation systems use this BLS classification to help determine what the nature of the problem was that the individual experienced. Now, wellness and workers' comp, if we look at this particular listing, this is from a Bureau of Labor Statistics recent review of all cases, U.S. cases, and it's all occupations, and then it breaks out the natural resources, construction, and maintenance industries, the red line, because those are some of the highest risk of workers' comp. So what you can see here is the various head, eye, neck, shoulder, hand, wrist, trunk, knee, foot, ankle, and then you see the difference between the red and the blue lines. So the blue lines are really can be looked at as more of your office workers and technology workers, education workers, more so than the people who are actually out doing physical labor as part of their day-to-day job. So this gives us some sense of the kinds of issues that might come up in a workers' compensation case or injury or pattern for an employer. That means that our wellness program should probably be sensitive to what the dominant kinds of injuries or illnesses that are encountered with a workers' compensation concern. Now, the industries with the top 20 highest workers' comp incidence rates in 2015 were the following. So fire protection is one of the highest incidence rates. So that's one of our most dangerous occupations. Police come second. Then we have skiing and aluminum smelting, steel foundries, sports teams, heavy construction, sawmills and woodworking, long-term care facilities, iron foundries, hospitals, ambulance services, and then on down through the rest of those things that are listed. So you can see the incidence rate, which is non-fatal workers' compensation cases per 100 full-time equivalents per year. So that's the basis. So you would read, the way you'd read this is there are 14 or almost 15 cases per 100 full-time equivalents per year. So that's at the high end. At the low end of that 20 are about 10 per year. The average for all industries is about 4.2. So that's the 4.2 injury incidents during per 100 individuals. So about 4% rate of injury each year. Let's look at work lost time injuries, the top 5 in 2015. We see that sprains is at the top of the list in terms of the nature of the injury. Bruises become second, cuts, fractures, and multiple injuries. And body parts affected, so you can see some of the issues. You can see also the source of injury or illness, walkways, sprains, bruises, cuts, worker motion, containers, events or exposure, the type of activity. So again, this is looking more deeply at what those work lost time injuries are and the top 5. Now, the major cost management pathways for workers' compensation that we generally look for are building management commitment and understanding about the risk that employees are encountering and how to reduce some of those risks of exposure to illness and injury. Implementing a strong safety and injury prevention program, working with the insurance company that may be insuring the risk or representing the L&I, the Labor and Industries, and those state level organizations that administer workers' comp, and insurance adjusters or individuals that are specialists in risk reduction and risk management. Implementing an effective return to work program, transitional duty program, coordinating medical care and managing medical costs for those that are experiencing illness or injury with work-related causes, recognizing and eliminating fraud and abuse, improving communication with employees and training supervisors in the appropriate safety practices, and reducing health risk in the workforce. And finally, providing risk education and safety perspective to employees, things like present moment thinking, where supervisors are helping employees realize it's important for them to be aware whatever they're involved in, thinking about that rather than thinking about something else or daydreaming. So that's called present moment thinking. So these are some of the major cost management pathways for the management of workers' compensation costs for employers. Now, when we think about the kinds of documents that are associated with a workers' compensation program, here are some of the most typical ones. First of all, some sort of written transitional duty policy, which is intended to help individuals understand some of that transitional duties when they're not up to full work activity. There's a work ability form, so it's the ability for you to work with an individual to have them recognize and tell you the level of capability that they have in attempting to see whether, as a supervisor, whether that individual is capable of working in a full performance of their duties and functions. There's transitional assignment forms, so that's the document that might be given to someone to help the individual supervisor receive someone who could be in a transitional work activity and to have that assignment be clear and the reporting and supervising individuals identified. There's post-injury procedure, so there's a general set of procedures that would help guide the return to work of the individual, as well as the protection and potentially work hardening or other activities that may be necessary to prevent further injury. There's worst to best benchmark performance list. So those are some of the things which are provided by industries and by insurers that in fact talk about how those benchmarks can change and what some normative comparisons and normative expressions of those might be in a worst to best scenario. The employee brochure, which is a general brochure for the employee to understand the workers' compensation policies, its purposes, and what their role is. An introduction letter to employees about the injury experience that they are currently in, and something which helps explain to them the expectations that are on the individual employee. There's an employee acknowledgement form, so the direction which the individual receives from human resources and or risk management staff and workers' comp staff could in fact be documented, that the employee has acknowledged the receipt of that information. Physician telephone contact questionnaire, so it's something that could be used to help guide a follow-up contact to ascertain the status of recovery or the status of treatment and or whether any other preventive activities need to be engaged in, but that can be a physician telephone contact questionnaire. A supervisor's guide to workers' compensation, so for new supervisors particularly to be aware of the policies and procedures which govern the injured worker. And a general manager best practices in workers' comp. So from the level of the top of the organization, a definition and description of what those best practices in workers' comp look like. So again, these are some of the kinds of documents which are implementing documents for workers' comp. This is oftentimes where wellness staff kind of come into play because they can in fact be involved in the actual occurrence in terms of helping the individual recover and or become more fit in terms of work activities and work challenges. The costs of workers' compensation, we want to look at the visible and the hidden costs. And our initial costs, the payroll costs, are usually a source of where the financial management people actually pick up workers' compensation costs. And that's when there is a set amount of either on the per hourly basis for wage and union employees, or just an amount which is a percent of the total payroll which is allocated to workers' compensation costs. If it's a separate policy with a external organization or insurer or a group or trust, that is oftentimes is labeled a premium cost for workers' comp. And the modification factor would be another one of the issues, and that's where the modification factor modifies the exposure that's the financial exposure for workers' comp, so that that amount which is set aside to cover the costs reflect perhaps an additional risk of that particular employer. Where we talk about improvements in workers' comp, we are generally talking about lowering the modification factors so that there's not as much funding of workers' comp, either in the payroll sense or the premium cost sense. Also, the compensation of possible replacements might be visible costs. So if we're in a school district and someone is injured and out due to a work-related injury or illness, then the compensation of those individuals as replacements could in fact be part of the visible costs of your workers' compensation program. The hidden costs are going to be overtime for other employees to fill in for the injured worker. They may be decreased overall productivity of affected employees, so they in fact are perhaps working and unable to have full productivity because of the additional duties of the absent individual. There's temporary help costs that may be incurred. There's possible loss of business due to having someone who perhaps is in a sales role or a role of customer service and having the loss of business associated with that. There's possible dissatisfied customers that are dealing with staff which are not necessarily fully trained because they're filling in for the individual that's absent. and then problems with employee morale that may occur because of the shift in duties and activities from the absent employee. So these are some of the hidden costs associated with workers' comp, as well as the visible costs. Now, possible workers' compensation analytics include two different kinds. What are the major trends affecting our workers' compensation costs in our organization? And one of the metrics that could be used, or analytics that could be used, is total worker compensation costs for each of the last 5 years and estimated for next year, so that you would see essentially trend-lined activity in the workers' comp area. The proportion of workers' comp costs attributable to medical reimbursement for each of the last 5 years. So that's segmenting out the portion of workers' comp costs that covers medical reimbursement. The per capita workers' compensation costs for each of the last 5 years and estimated for next year. So that's breaking it down from the total cost in the first check mark, or the first bullet, to the per capita, which helps us adjust to workforce changes and size that occurred during the year. Average annual cost per reported injury case for each of the last 5 years. That's a reflection of the severity of the workers' compensation injuries or illnesses. The average annual number of reported injuries per 100 full-time equivalent employees for each of the last 5 years. That 100 full-time equivalent we saw used as a unit of analysis in one of the Bureau of Labor Statistics charts that was earlier in this module. So that's an average annual number of reported injuries per 100 FTEs. We can then map that out as a trend and show what kinds of trends are affecting workers' comp costs and occurrences. Percent of reported work injuries that result in workers' compensation claims for each of the last 5 years. So those work injuries are oftentimes reported to an occupational health unit or someone that's functioning in that capacity. And then percent of compensable claims by major event or exposure for the last 5 years. So that's the percent of compensable claims by major event or exposure. So we may identify major exposures as perhaps 30 days or more of absence, or 10 days or more of absence, or 11 days of absence. So we can set different criteria on that. What workers' compensation metrics should be routinely tracked? So there we're looking at the average worker compensation cost per FTE by geographic location. We are looking at the percent of total corporate-wide claims costs for each year, and the annual incidence rate of workers' comp cases per 100 FTEs per year. Those and the average claims cost by category of major event or exposure for each year. So these are some of the metrics that might be routinely tracked to watch what's happening with our workers' compensation experience. Otherwise, what happens is, my experience dictates that people oftentimes have individual accidents or injuries occurring. They have workers' compensation claims occurring, but they're so diffuse and so invisible that no one really kind of understands what's happening overall. So as a manager, I would want to be looking at some metrics which helped me get a sense of what the trends are that were affecting the workers' comp costs, and also what those metrics of occurrence and performance are around workers' comp. Now let's look at the issues of estimating the value of workers' compensation savings and tracking the experience and making some sort of assessment of the effects of a wellness intervention or wellness set of interventions. And in general, we're going to look at first of all, the strategic issues, then we'll look at the methodological issues. And the issues around the strategic approach to evaluating the estimating the cost of workers' compensation savings is, are we self-insured or in a state pool? If we're in a state pool, any reductions we see may not lead to any financial or economic savings, because the savings, it goes back to the state pool. So if we're self-insured, and many states have a self-insurance option but it's usually required. It requires a minimum number of employees covered under workers' comp, maybe 200, 400, 600, 1,000. That's different in different states. Also, the strategic issue is, are we just looking at the visible, or are we going to attempt to look at any of the hidden costs or cost reduction over time? Are we looking at the pattern of costs in terms of the mix of wage and salary continuation and medical reimbursement? Are we looking at all just the closed cases only, or are we including open cases for the years that we're examining experience in workers' comp? And what is our time period involved? What's the length of time we are looking at and making comparisons to in terms of baseline, and then looking at experience under a wellness program as the experimental period? We're looking at the issue of the validity of the data. Is this data that's been edited? Has it been corrected or reviewed? Do we have any idea that the data we're looking at is in fact valid for the periods of time we want to examine? And has there been any change in vendors that may have changed the protocols and the processes and policies that govern claims adjudication? So these are going to be the primary strategic issues in estimating the value of workers' compensation savings associated with a wellness program. Now let's look at estimating the value of workers' compensation savings from a methodological issue and perspective. Ceteris paribus is the Latin for all things being equal. Can we in fact say that nothing has changed in the operation of the workers' compensation program that would account for changes in either incidence or severity, which is what we're attempting to judge and examine related to the wellness program's role? What are the econometric assumptions that are governing our approach? And that's what are we using as our basis of extrapolating, our basis of assigning value or estimating the effects of these areas. The actual wage or salary continuation costs, are we using averages? So are we using the actual wage and salary continuation cost for the individuals involved that were injured, or are we taking some averages for our population and using that basis for determining savings? Also, are we using actual medical reimbursement claims costs? So are we estimating those, or are we actually looking at claims costs related to the workers' comp area? And are we looking at participant and non-participant comparisons? Are we somehow able and have a large enough population to look at the workers' compensation experience of those that are participants in the wellness program and those that are non-participants? And can we make any assessment of those differences? And finally, are we going to be using discounting or using constant dollar analysis in any way? Are we looking at translating the economic cost and being able to take out the time-related variable in how those costs are examined? Now let's look at an example of estimating workers' compensation savings from a wellness program. And let's start with the case details. Let's start with 2,000 employees. 1,000 of them are program participants in the wellness program. The average annual workers' cost per full-time equivalent for participants and non-participants pre and post is what we're using as our methodology. The non-participants we find in the post period under the wellness program. Non-participants' costs go up an average of $56 each. So that's a $56 increment of annual cost increase in workers' comp cost on average. The participant cost is $149 less. So the differential there is assuming the effect is consistent across subpopulations, across all of the groups, and assume that wellness program cost is about $100 per employee per year. So that's the estimate of our wellness program cost. No other plausible explanation for observed changes. We didn't change vendors. We didn't change any of our processes for workers' comp. There wasn't any change in policies or staff. And the way in which that would come out, the calculation would be as follows. We have 1,000 non-participants. That's $56,000. That's what that cost would be. For the 1,000 participants, we have 149,000 reduced cost. The difference in the differential, if participants would have had the same experience as non-participants, the total cost would have been greater by 56,000 rather than lower by 149,000. Instead, the actual cost was 205,000 less, and that's the combination of 56,000 and 149,000. That's $205 of savings per participant for the year. The benefit cost ratio is the division of that $205 by the $100 wellness program cost, which gives us a benefit to cost ratio of $205 to $100, or 2.05 to 1 in terms of benefit to cost ratio, and an ROI of 205%. So this would be an example of taking this case and being able to look at the differences from time period 1 to time period 2, pre and post, to give an estimate of what that differential cost is between the participants and non-participants. They are actuarially credible sized populations, and they would allow us to then make an estimate that based on workers' comp cost savings, the ROI for just the workers' comp would be about 205%. Now, how wellness programming can affect workers' comp? It's primarily through reduction of risk. That reduces our exposure significantly, if you remember some of those earlier slides, with the 20 times the amount of workers' comp cost and 12 times in the multiple risk factor analysis. It improves the morbidity, so we're reducing illness and injury in the population. We're increasing medical self-care skills, so we're helping people be able to handle some of those issues without consulting and needing to consult healthcare professionals. Improved consumerism health or consumer health skills, so some of the issues around compliance and questions and understanding and health literacy, those are also some of the things that we can potentially work on. It improves self-efficacy, so that's the level of confidence that someone has in going through the healing process and the use of health services. There's symptom relief, so if we are reducing risk and improving the healthy context of lifestyle, then we are likely to have some symptom relief in terms of fewer symptoms and the ability to handle those symptoms in a more effective way. And then injury prevention, which is where we are essentially reducing the risk-taking behavior, improving present moment thinking, doing things to help reduce the injury occurrence. And finally, some stress reduction activity, and that's things like present moment thinking as a way of being able to help reduce some of the stress associated with a job situation. So these are some of the ways that wellness programming can be targeted specifically on workers' compensation risk and exposure. Now, a summary of key points. Workers' compensation costs are typically the smallest health-related cost for most organizations. So that's in terms of the size and magnitude, we are generally looking at the smallest health-related cost. Depending on the industry, workers' compensation risk can be 3.5 times the average. So we in fact have everything from average all the way up to 3.5 times the average experience in terms of risk. So that's the range of risk that we might see in terms of exposure. There are a number of pathways for controlling workers' compensation costs. All workers are covered by it, so we in fact have that complete coverage, universal coverage. Selected health risk increased workers' comp costs significantly. So when we look at overall wellness scores and we look at 12 to 20 times the amount of workers' comp costs, that is potentially an issue. Multiple health risk increase workers' comp costs in a geometric manner. So when we have multiple health risk and we have very low overall wellness scores, we end up seeing geometric increases rather than additive or mathematical increases. There are classification systems that can help us understand workers' comp experience. The BLS is one of the main ones used in the industry. There are both analytics and metrics that should be tracked for workers' comp experience. So we saw a number of those analytics and metrics that would be useful for tracking what our workers' comp experience is. Work-related injuries and illnesses also significantly disrupt overall work productivity. So our ability to have those affected and be disrupting overall work productivity occurs, and we'd like to reduce that by reducing our incidence and our severity of workers' comp cases. Worker compensation issues are not always as clean as you would think. So the idea that some of these workers' comp cases originate from something I did at home, I bring it to work because it's got better cost sharing than my health plan does. So I would rather have it under workers' comp. So there is effect going both ways in terms of into workers' comp and out of workers' comp, depending on issues that really have to do with the practicality of a worker's decision making. Worksite wellness has many different interventions that can help to reduce worker comp exposure or costs. So these are the summary of key points from this particular module. Now let's look at some key questions. Our first question is, how exactly do selected health risk increased workers' comp costs? And when we think about it, for instance, the smoker may be distracted by their smoking behavior from work activity that needs to be carried out. The unfit worker may in fact be less able to contend with physical demands of the work that he or she is performing. The obese employee may in fact be at greater risk because of the reaction time, the difficulty of movement, the way in which their body is increasingly subjected to greater strain and stress with movement. Those are things that occur. In addition, there can be more extensive injury from people who may be either unfit, obese, and or unable to function effectively. Perhaps their exposure to maybe chemicals in the air may be impeded or affect their ability due to the underlying problems of tobacco, smoke, and lung function. So those are some other areas in which selected risk factors will impact on workers' compensation experience. It also can lead to a slower recovery and a return to work. So if they are one of those individuals with an overall low wellness score and several health risks, their recovery process may be greater. They may have more extensive injury associated with something that might not have injured someone else that was not with a low overall wellness score. And the general issue also is the compounding effect of one set of risk factors in working on or compounding the adverse effects of others. So the idea that if you take a smoker, you take someone who's inactive, who's overweight, may in fact have some musculoskeletal already existing sprains and strains. They then try to do maybe lift something or climb into a place, to get something down from an upper area, and they put themselves at risk and end up getting injured. So those are all the combination of issues that affect a worker around workers' compensation experience. Our second question is, how do open cases affect measurement of workers' compensation experience and metrics? And in general, we're dealing with cases that are not closed. So we don't know the full range of both medical reimbursement and salary continuation costs associated with that case. So we're undercounting the severity of those open cases. We're actually ending up with a fairly distorted look at the case because they're open, they've got more recovery to go through, yet we don't see any costs associated with that future recovery. So that if care is not complete, if they have incomplete measurement of costs and incomplete measurement of the impairment itself, And we also have the phenomena that the longer the case is open, the more costly it is likely to be. So there are dynamics in these in addition to whether we include open cases in our analysis. So the ideal would be just use closed cases in our analysis of the savings in workers' comp rather than carrying over the open cases. But oftentimes that's not necessarily possible given the limited number of cases that are usually experienced in a given workforce related to the exposure. That goes back to the somewhere between 10 and 14 of these cases per 100 full-time equivalents in the highest level of exposure or liability around worker compensation risk. Third question is, we have a relatively small workforce. How does that affect our look at workers' comp? And I think it makes sense to use in the small work site to have more focus on the work effects of injured workers, so that the absent employee or the employee that cannot work fully and is in a transitional state has implications for the productivity of other employees. So it's really looking more at the collective effects of having an injured worker either in the work site and injured or limited in their what they can do, or having them absent related to a worker compensation case or existing problem. So that, I think, makes more sense in a relatively small workforce where you might have 20 employees or 10 employees or 50 employees. That changes some of the dynamics away from pure economic issues to really more of a productivity emphasis. Now that you've completed this module, go ahead and take the quiz.